The F-15 and F-16 are two of the best fighter jets on Earth, even if they aren't named F-35 or F-22. So why not give older versions of these planes to Ukraine? The official Twitter account for the Air Force of Ukraine publicly requested that NATO provide them with Western fighter jets like the F-16 Fighting Falcon and F-15 Eagle to aid them in their fight against Russia last week. According to the social media statement, Ukraine's Air Force sees securing these fighters as essential to the defense of their nation, as they offer advanced systems that are on par or superior to those of the Russian Air Force. According to Ukraine, their pilots could be trained and ready to fly these American jets into combat after just 2 or 3 weeks of training, but the truth is, flying the F-15 or F-16 into the fight takes a whole lot more than a moderately trained pilot. While it may not take long for these aviators to learn how to execute the fundamentals of flying in a new cockpit, combat is a test like few others. Ukraine's Air Force has fought courageously to keep the airspace over their embattled nation contested, not allowing Russia's superior numbers or technology to take the skies from them, despite the odds. In the minds of many, this presents an opportunity for America's high-performance fourth-generation fighters to press the Russian military back toward its own borders, especially as Russian forces retreat and reposition to focus their efforts on Donbas, in eastern Ukraine. But the truth is, providing Ukraine with aircraft like the multi-purpose Dynamo F-16 or the air superiority Champ F-15 is a much bigger ask than many may realize. Not only would doing so be a massive undertaking, it likely wouldn't offer a significant benefit over alternative less risky means of providing support. Why does Ukraine want the F-15 and F-16 if they don't fly them? Despite growing increasingly friendly with the West in recent years, Ukraine's stockpiles of military equipment remain largely comprised of Soviet-era tech, and that includes their air force. While the F-15 and F-16 have been flying since the 1970s, Ukraine has been operating two very different fighters, the Sukhoi Su-27 and Mikoyan MiG-29. This is why previous efforts to funnel fighters into Ukraine centered around Poland's fleet of MiG-29s, which were seen as the easiest jets to transition Ukrainian pilots into. If we're going by the dates these aircraft entered service, Ukraine's are technically newer designs than America's Fighting Falcon and Eagle, with the MiG-29 first joining Russia's operational fleets in 1982 and the Su-27 joining in 1985. Versus the F-16's 1978 and F-15's 1976. In fact, these Soviet fighters were developed specifically to compete with the very American fighters Ukraine is requesting, just as the American jets in question were developed to outcompete the previous slew of Soviet fighters. They have good reason to suspect NATO fighters would do the trick. The F-16 was originally meant to be a lightweight air superiority fighter that has since demonstrated a great deal of value as a multi-role platform. The F-15 comes with an even more impressive reputation, and in fact, the Eagle is the most dominant air superiority fighter of its era, and perhaps others. With a reported combat record of 104 air victories and 0 losses, there is not another fighter in the sky with the proven dogfighting chops of the F-15. It takes at least 6 weeks to help trained American fighter pilots transition to the F-16 from another jet. Because Ukraine's pilots are accustomed to the cockpits of Soviet-era fighters, it would take some real getting used to before they could effectively fly the F-16 or F-15 in combat. Ukraine claims they could make the transition in a matter of just 2 or 3 weeks, and while this seems extremely unlikely, it may be feasible given the nation's difficult circumstances. The Air Force actually already has a course designed to train existing fighter pilots to get behind the stick of an F-16 Fighting Falcon, and although these pilots are already accustomed to American fighters, as Ukrainian pilots would not be, the course still takes over 6 weeks. It's possible that Ukrainian pilots could considerably condense this training course, but the chances that they would leave their crash course with a high degree of competence in their new aircraft seems unlikely. But importantly, Ukraine has never operated these aircraft, so simply landing a few of these jets on a Ukrainian airstrip and tossing them the keys wouldn't be enough to actually fly these jets in combat. In fact, getting the aircraft into Ukraine would probably be the easy part. The Air Force uses 25 maintainers for every one tactical aircraft. While all fighter jets are not created equal, there is one universal truth when it comes to operating them: it takes a ton of maintenance, even for aircraft like the F-16 that is renowned for being fairly inexpensive to operate. In fact, as a general rule of thumb, each F-16 requires about 16 hours of maintenance for every 1 hour spent flying. According to the U.S. Air Force's 332D Air Expeditionary Wing, which operates both the F-15E Strike Eagle and F-16C Fighting Falcon, among other aircraft, it takes a ratio of 25 maintainers to every one aircraft to keep their equipment in good working order. Of course, it could be done with fewer techs, but hard combat flying will undoubtedly require more maintenance and repairs than standard training flights might. The weapons fighter jets use need technicians, and logistics, too. You may not realize it if you've never spent much time on the flight line, but the weapons employed by fighter jets like America's F-15 and F-16 are entirely different than those employed by the Soviet-era fighters in service for Ukraine. You can't simply strap a Russian R-27 air-to-air missile to an F-16 and assume it'll work when you pull the trigger. Modern air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles and even many modern bombs are complex pieces of technology that require specific mounting hardware and specially trained technicians to be employed successfully. Air Force aircraft armament system specialists are tasked with arming America's F-15 and F-16 fleets, and Ukraine would need similarly trained personnel on their own airstrips. This too requires a great deal of in-depth training, somewhere between 45 and 86 days worth, according to the Air Force. Of course, Ukraine already has weapons technicians, so it may not take the same amount of time to spin them up regarding how to properly arm these aircraft, but it certainly isn't something that could be done overnight. Ukraine would have to take F-15s and F-16s into Russia to win the skies. As we've already discussed regarding the establishment of a NATO-enforced no-fly zone over Ukraine, advanced Russian air defense systems like the S-400 Triumph have an operational range of around 250 miles. That means Ukrainian fighters would need to engage air defense systems inside Russia and potentially even Belarus in order to take control of their airspace, as multiple Ukrainian officials and pilots have championed as part of the request for these fighters. Otherwise, these air defense platforms could continue to shoot down Ukrainian jets that strayed too close to Russian territory. But Russian air defense systems aren't the biggest reason Ukraine would need to send its newly gained F-15 and F-16 fleets into Russia. The biggest reason is that most Russian airstrikes are launched by aircraft that never leave Russian airspace. Ukraine would lose a lot of fighters and the war would go on. There is no chance that NATO could provide Ukraine with enough F-15 or F-16 airframes to offset Russia's massive numerical advantage in the region. All told, Russia has some 1,500 combat aircraft, making it the second largest air force in the world. Ukraine began the war with fewer than 100, and now has closer to 50. Providing Ukraine with even dozens of Western fighters, which is extremely unlikely, wouldn't be enough to put them on even footing. Instead, Ukrainian pilots in jets they only barely knew would fly into combat against Russian pilots who have trained in their own respective aircraft for years. Then they'd land their fighters on airstrips that would be targeted for repeated missile strikes, where techs and maintainers who only have a few weeks training on these platforms would have to turn them around and get them back into the fight extremely quickly, just to do it all again against the same overwhelming odds. This is a recipe for a lot of downed jets and a lot of dead, injured, or captured pilots.